This is not clickbait, because despite what others may advocate on YouTube, there is no perfect mix template. You see, the whole point of having flexibility of being able to work, whether that be on a large SSL analog desk or on a door, is that we all work in different ways and have different workflows. So I'm not going to give you the perfect mix template, but I'm going to show you how I put together my mix template, which, for the way that I work, is perfect. Here we have a song called Hard Times. It has 36 tracks, all of which have been consolidated. That is to say that the clips on each track have been consolidated together to create a single clip per track that are all the same size, starting and ending in the same position. There is a previous episode showing how we prepared this song for mixing. I'll leave a link in the description below. If we were to look at the mix window, you would see that we have violins, sax, piano, guitars, bass, drums and vocals. But first we need to set up a master fader and a submix fader. A submix fader is often referred to as the mix bus or the 2 bus. I like to make sure that my 2 output faders are deep red. When I'm setting up these new sessions, I'm often asked why I have both a submix fader and a master fader. The difference is in the inserts. On the submix track, the inserts are pre-fader. That is to say that the signal comes through the inserts first, thereby going through the plugins on those inserts first, before going to the fader. Whereas on the master track, the signal goes through the master fader before it goes through the inserts. So why does this matter? Well, if you take a compressor and put it on the submix fader, as you bring the fader down, the amount of signal driving the compressor doesn't change. Therefore, the threshold trigger doesn't change, providing a constant and balanced level. If, however, you put the same compressor with the same settings on the master fader, as you bring down the fader, you are reducing the signal flow into the compressor, thereby changing the threshold trigger and changing how the compressor behaves. So I tend to put the following on my master fader inserts. The first one is an instance of Magic AB. This allows me to load reference tracks that I can then compare my mix to a professionally recorded mix. I then like to put a VU meter on, and I'll show you later in this series how I use that. After that, I put an instance of isotopes inside. So this gives me a spectrogram, a spectrum analyzer and a sound field. This actually looks at how the spread of the sound is in the stereo field, as well as the output levels. And finally, I have another instance of a spectrum analyzer. I shall show you how I use these later in the series. On my submix fader, I tend to put the following. The first is an NLS bus. I will explain later in this video what this does. I like to mix into a master bus compressor, and I use the SSL G master bus compressor for this purpose. I will also use a basic limiter to see how the mix sits at louder settings. Again, I'll cover more on this later. As mentioned earlier, there are several sections of instruments which I like to route to stem tracks. This allows me to bounce or print the different sections. It also allows me to do some processing on the stems if need be. So we will set up 9 stem tracks. One of the advantages of the digital domain is that you can add as many auxiliary tracks and route the signal through them without any sound degradation. The advantage is that you can manipulate the sound at each stage, reducing the amount of work or plugins on each track. The disadvantage is if you're not organised, you can get a bit lost. On each of the stem tracks, I also like to add another summing plugin to give the mix a bit more of an analog feel. I use again the NSL channel. I will cover more of the philosophy of this and what I do on the individual tracks at a later stage. So we have a stem for each of the sections, one for effects and one for all music. This is so we can separate all the music from the drums and vocals. Now you might think we will route all of the strings to the string stem and drums to the drum stem, etc. Well, no, I like to add a further auxiliary track next to each of the instrument groups. So for example, the strings will be routed to the strings auxiliary output, and then the auxiliary output will then be sent to the stems. Likewise with all the other sections. This allows me to apply any EQ, compression or effects before it gets sent to the stems. Also, if I were to add some individual reverbs or effect tracks to the strings, or even a parallel processing tracks, this would first get routed to the auxiliary track before getting summed over to the stems. I'll create one of these for each of the instrument sections. For the vocals, I create both a lead vocals subtrack and a backing vocals subtrack. Again, the reason for this is if I wanted to use a different type of reverb on the lead vocal as opposed to the backing vocals. So now that we have all the individual tracks, we need to route them to the respective auxiliary tracks, the auxiliary tracks routed to the stem tracks, and as we have already done, the stems are routed to the submix track. Finally, I create several effect tracks. These will be for reverbs and delays, and we'll cover these in a bit more detail in a later episode. Before we go into the last process of this video, if you found the video helpful, please hit that like button. It really does help the channel out. And if you want to follow this series of mixing videos, don't forget to click that subscribe button. Before we start to listen to the tracks, there is one more setup process I like to do. There is a fascinating insight into mixing presented by Michael White called The Fundamentals of Mixing. I'll leave a link in the description below. Mike has mixed the likes of Whitney Houston, and he goes into great detail in this series of videos as to how he approaches the mixing process. One episode he explains how he uses certain plugins to get that analog feel and sound. He uses different plugins to mimic different types of mixing desks, including Neves and SSLs. Having done the same exercise in the past, I always come back to preferring the SSL sound. So I add an SSL EQ plugin on each and every channel, as well as the NLS Channel plugin on the stems. Even if I don't use the plugin, the signal running through it adds that bit of warmth of an analog desk. By using the SSL Channel plugin on each track, the NLS Channel on each stem, and the NLS Bus on the Submix channel, as well as the G Master Bus compressor, you can see how we have emulated the warmth and the sound of an SSL desk. So the final step of the setup process is to colorize the tracks by instrument type. And I like to use the same color coding for every song that we do. So for example, strings are always green. Brass is always gold. Pianos are always brown. Guitars are always blue. Bass, dark blue. Drums, red. And vocals, pink. I like to leave the auxiliary channels and the effects channels as green. Now we have all the tracks organized, color coded, and ready for the next stage. So in this series of mixing videos, I'm trying to keep each episode to be no more than a 10-minute video. So if you have any questions about my mix template, or as we go through the next stages, my mixing process, please feel free to put them in the comments below. The next step will be to establish a static or starting mix, and we'll be covering how we do that in the next episode. So be sure to hit that subscribe and notification bell so you don't miss any of this mixing series.